Olivia Smith, a shy, ordinary girl living in a small world of doubt, never imagined she'd be the one chosen by Samuel Harris, a millionaire doctor with deep blue eyes like the ocean and a heart once frozen by pain. From a chance encounter in a clinic where fear and shame intertwined, to the moment two souls found each other amid life's storms, this is more than a love story. It's about the courage to step beyond one's own shadows. Can Olivia trust in the miracle called Samuel? And does love have the power to heal the deepest scars? Don't look away. This tale will make you believe that sometimes, the most ordinary person can be the brightest star in someone's sky. Olivia Smith's trembling hands gripped the clipboard as if it were the last lifeboat in a storm-tossed sea. Her slender fingers clutched the cheap ballpoint pen tightly, sweat soaking her palms and turning them into a damp, chaotic mess. The waiting room of the Samuel Women's Health Clinic was dazzling, almost extravagant. The floor gleamed like a mirror, the pristine white walls whispered of modernity, but no soft light or soothing music could calm the tempest of anxiety churning in her stomach. Her heart pounded like an amateur drummer at their first concert as her eyes scanned the admission form in front of her. Name, date of birth, medical history, childishly simple questions. But to Olivia, they were a labyrinth with no exit. She wiped her sweaty hands on her faded jeans, muttering to herself, "Just fill out the form, Olivia. It's not that hard." But it was hard, terribly so. Her entire life had been a series of efforts to avoid this very moment. She'd convinced herself that a gynecologist was an unnecessary luxury, that her body would manage itself like some miraculous machine. But after weeks of discomfort and sleepless nights with Google as her companion, where every click led to horror movie scenarios, she'd finally surrendered. The receptionist, a middle-aged woman with a smile as bright as summer sunshine, had enthusiastically declared, "Dr. Samuel Harris is the best doctor in the city." At the time, Olivia hadn't cared. To her, doctors were stern, silver-haired old men in white coats, like ancient gods of medicine. Oh, how wrong she'd been. A nurse stepped into the waiting room, her voice ringing like a bell. "Olivia Smith?" Olivia nearly leapt from her chair, her heart dancing wildly in her chest as if trying to break free. She swallowed hard, clutching the form like it was her final shield, and followed the nurse down the hallway on shaky legs. The sharp scent of antiseptic hit her nose, cold and ominous like a warning from fate. The closed doors lining the corridor looked like secrets waiting to be unveiled, twisting her stomach into tighter knots. "Sit here," the nurse said with a polite smile, gesturing to a chair in the exam room. "Dr. Samuel will be right in." Olivia nodded, but she could barely breathe. She sat down, back rigid as a ruler in her old teacher's hand, her fingers clasped tightly in her lap as if in prayer. The room was impeccably neat, almost sterile. Framed diplomas hung on the walls like a warrior's medals, a polished wooden desk sat modestly in the corner, and beside it loomed the towering gynecological chair, a steel monster straight out of a sci-fi film. She tried not to stare at it, but her eyes kept darting over as if it were whispering, "I know you're afraid of me, Olivia." Her fingers twisted together, dancing a nervous waltz, while her mind rehearsed a dozen lines. "Stay calm, act natural, just get through this." Then the door opened and Olivia forgot how to breathe. The man who entered wasn't the doctor she'd pictured. Not old, not stern, nothing like the classic portraits of medicine. Dr. Samuel Harris was tall, broad-shouldered like a fortress wall, with dark tousled hair that carried the charm of an autumn breeze. His jawline was sharp enough to make any sculptor jealous, and his deep blue eyes shimmered like a fathomless lake, radiating natural confidence. He was absurdly handsome, like a movie star lost in a world of white coats. "Miss Olivia?" His voice was gentle, calm, and professional to every syllable, paired with a reassuring smile that could melt ice. Olivia tried to respond, but her mouth was dry, her tongue turned to stone. She was too busy panicking. He's young. He's attractive. And he's about to examine her. Oh God, no. Samuel sat across from her, flipping through her chart with the composure of someone accustomed to every storm. "I see this is your first time seeing a gynecologist?" Olivia nodded so fast she worried her neck might snap. He smiled, a warm smile like sunlight filtering through leaves, and said, "I know this can be nerve-wracking, but I promise we'll take it slow at your pace. Nothing happens unless you're ready." She nodded again, her cheeks burning like tiny furnaces. Samuel noticed her tension immediately. The way she avoided his gaze like dodging bullets. The way she sat stiff as a forgotten statue in a museum. The way she seemed to want to melt into the chair. She was different, not like the confident or flirtatious patients he'd encountered before. He leaned forward, his voice soft as a breeze over a field. "How are you feeling?" Olivia gripped her hands tighter, stammering, "Fine, fine," though the whole world knew she was lying. Samuel chuckled. A warm, clear sound like church bells on a winter day. "You don't have to worry. I promise I'm not a three-headed monster." Olivia silently wished it were otherwise. He wasn't frightening because he was a doctor, but because of what he stirred in her. Her heart raced like a wild horse breaking free, her palms damp as if dipped in water, her body hyper-aware of his every move, from the way he turned a page to the way he tilted his head. She'd never reacted to anyone like this, and it terrified her more than the exam chair. But the worst part? Samuel noticed. He saw her body language, the wide, hesitant eyes, the cherry blossom flush on her cheeks, the way she dodged his gaze like avoiding blinding sunlight. To him, she was endearing, not in the flashy way of the confident, but in a fragile way that made one want to protect her. Samuel had seen thousands of patients, the arrogant, the anxious, even the shameless flirts. But Olivia? She was a breath of fresh air, a puzzle he found himself wanting to solve. Her shyness awakened something in him, a protective instinct, a stir he'd never allowed himself to feel at work. He was a young millionaire, a successful man with a perfectly ordered life, but now in front of this girl he felt adrift. He cleared his throat, shoving those feelings deep down, telling himself, "Focus, Samuel. She's a patient, not a dream." "Before we start," he said, keeping his tone as gentle as a lullaby, "do you have any questions?" Olivia hesitated. Her mind was an ocean of questions. "How old are you? Are you married? Why are you so ridiculously handsome?" But they all died in her throat, so she just shook her head, her wide eyes gazing at him like a lost fawn. Samuel lingered on her for a moment, as if trying to read the secrets behind her silence, then smiled. "All right, let's get started." And Olivia knew for certain that this appointment would feel longer than a lifetime. Not because of the medical procedures, but because her heart had already fallen into the whirlpool of those deep blue eyes. A young millionaire, a brilliant doctor, and a man quietly falling for her, even if he hadn't yet admitted it to himself. That day, Olivia Smith's heart still pounded like a wild horse breaking free as she stepped onto the crowded sidewalk, her hands damp with sweat as if they'd just been dipped into a river of anxiety. Her cheeks burned, flushed red like two ripe apples in the midst of autumn, not from the harsh sunlight, but from the embarrassment scorching her from the inside out. Never, not once in her 30 years of shy, shadowed existence, had she felt so utterly out of place. Dr. Samuel Harris was too much. Too handsome like a living Greek statue. Too captivating like the glow of a full moon. Too overwhelming like an unexpected storm. And the worst part? He was kind, gentle, understanding. A soothing balm she couldn't resist. That made everything 1,000 times worse, because she couldn't lash out at him. She could only curse herself. Furious at the way her stomach flipped as if someone had thrown her off a cliff when he spoke. Furious at the way her skin tingled like an electric shock when he brushed her hand in a polite handshake. Furious that she'd nearly melted into a useless puddle on the clinic floor just because his gaze landed on her. She swore to herself. She'd never go back, not in a million years. But fate, like a mischievous trickster with a cunning plan, always had other ideas. 2 weeks later, Olivia ignored every call from the clinic like a child dodging homework. Medication adjustments? Didn't care. Follow-up appointment? Never. She told herself she could tough it out, that those nagging symptoms would vanish like clouds after rain. But life isn't a fairy tale, and her body wasn't magic. The symptoms worsened like uninvited guests pounding relentlessly at her door, forcing her to face reality. Avoidance didn't make problems disappear. So there she was again, sitting in the same waiting room, gripping the armrests of the chair like they were a life preserver in a stormy sea. This time she prayed silently in desperation, like a lost believer pleading with the heavens. "Please give me a different doctor. Someone older, silver-haired, boring as an old textbook. Someone who won't make my heart race anymore." But life, like a drama-loving director, clearly hated her. When the nurse called her name and led her to the room, there he was again. Dr. Samuel Harris, unfairly handsome like sunlight streaming through stained glass, his deep blue eyes sparkling like gems in a desert. He looked up from her chart as she entered, a smile blooming on his lips like a flower bursting open in the dead of winter. "Olivia," he said, his voice warm and rich like a summer symphony. "I was starting to think you were avoiding me." Her breath caught, as if someone had squeezed her throat, her stomach twisting into a chaotic knot. She hurried to sit, eyes glued to the floor as if it were a map to escape this nightmare. "I know it's not that," she stammered, the clumsy lie slipping through her teeth like a bumbling thief. Samuel leaned forward, resting his arms on the desk, his gaze flickering with a mix of amusement and curiosity, like an explorer discovering new territory. "You missed the follow-up call," he said, his tone gentle but sharp like an arrow hitting its mark. "We tried reaching you but you didn't answer." Olivia felt like cornered prey, her heart hammering as if it might burst from her chest. I've been busy," she mumbled, knowing full well her excuse was as flimsy as a butterfly's wing in the wind. Samuel didn't buy it, not for a second. But instead of calling her out, he just smiled. A smile as soft as waves lapping at the shore, strong enough to melt every layer of her defenses. He studied her closely, noticing every little detail. The way she fidgeted with her sleeve like a nervous child, the way her shoulders tensed as if strung tight like a bowstring, the way her eyes darted away like a bird fearing a bending branch. She was scared, just like last time, and it made his heart, that of a doctor who'd seen thousands of patients, soften like soil after rain. Olivia wasn't like anyone else. The delicacy in her movements, the fragility like crystal that made him want to tread lightly, slowly, to make her feel safe. It was an odd sensation, an unexpected breeze stirring his soul. A man accustomed to control and reason. Meanwhile, for Olivia, every second in that room was a refined torture. She knew he was just doing his job, that he didn't think of her the way she imagined, or rather the way she feared she imagined. But that didn't help. Every glance from him was a needle piercing her fragile shell, every word a hammer striking her crumbling wall of reason. She had to get out of there, fast. So when the appointment ended, she practically bolted for the door, muttering an awkward thank you like an actor forgetting their lines, then disappearing down the hallway like a bird streaking across the sky. Samuel stood there, watching her retreating figure, a nameless disappointment welling up inside him. He wondered why his heart felt so heavy, not suspecting that fate would soon bring them together again. Not in the clinic, but in an entirely different scene. A few days later, as Samuel stepped into his favorite coffee shop, a place where he often sought peace before a shift, his eyes landed on a familiar figure. Olivia sat by the window, curled up like a little cat with a book in her hands, the soft light filtering through the glass illuminating her soft brown hair. She hadn't seen him yet, lost in her pages, occasionally tucking a strand of hair behind her ear or biting her lip in concentration like a diligent student mid-lesson. Here she was at peace, so different from the tense version of her in the clinic. No trembling shoulders, no evasive glances, just Olivia, natural as a breeze over a field. Samuel hesitated, his heart skipping a beat, because in that moment, she wasn't a patient. She was a person. Someone he suddenly longed to know, not just through chart notes, but through stories, smiles, and the secrets she kept hidden. He took a deep breath, stepped forward, and leaned slightly against the table with a tentative smile. "Olivia." She froze mid-sip, the coffee cup nearly slipping from her hands. Her eyes widened, snapping up to meet his like a startled deer in the woods. For a second she just stared, her brain seemingly shutting down, then abruptly choked on her coffee, coughing violently as if fate had just pranked her. Samuel bit back a laugh, but the corners of his mouth curled up in delight. Olivia wanted to sink through the floor. For the second time in a row, Samuel Harris had thrown her into absolute chaos. She gripped the coffee cup like an anchor in a storm, her heart still pounding like a war drum. He stood there, tall and striking, his sharp blue eyes glinting like a lighthouse in the dark. Hi," she stammered, wiping her mouth with the back of her hand in utter mortification. Samuel chuckled, a sound as warm as morning sun, then slid into the seat across from her without waiting for an invitation. "I didn't know you came here," he said, glancing around the coffee shop with curious eyes. "This is my usual spot." Olivia swallowed hard, trying not to panic. This wasn't where she'd imagined seeing him again. No white coat, no antiseptic smell, just him, sitting across from her like an old friend. I like the quiet," she mumbled, hoping he wouldn't notice her voice trembling like dry leaves in the wind. Samuel smiled, his gaze as gentle as waves on sand. And then, for the first time, a comfortable silence settled between them. Olivia stole a glance at him, really looked at him. The tailored shirt hugging his solid frame, sleeves rolled up to reveal forearms carved like marble, the gleaming watch on his wrist a quiet declaration of wealth. He belonged to another world, glamorous, confident, perfect, while she was just a shy girl with a tangled heart. But he sat there looking at her like she was the most wondrous thing in the room. And that, more than anything, terrified her to her very core. A few days later, Olivia Smith's world tilted like a small boat caught in raging waves. She was casually scrolling through her phone, her fingers gliding across the screen like a bird soaring through the sky, when she froze at a headline that hit her like a punch. Her stomach sank like an anchor plunging to the ocean floor. Dr. Samuel Harris, the millionaire doctor behind the Harris Medical Group. Her heart thundered, a wild symphony of pounding drums. With wide, stunned eyes, she clicked the article, each word hammering at the walls of her innocence. Samuel wasn't just a doctor. He was a doctor with a capital D, a shining star in gynecology, a pioneer with a string of hospitals bearing his name, including the small clinic where she trembled her way inside. And above all, he was rich, unimaginably rich, like a modern-day prince stepping out of a fairy tale. Olivia nearly forgot to breathe, the air in the room thickening like fog. It wasn't his success that floored her, but the fact that she'd naively believed he was just an ordinary man with a warm smile and gentle eyes. Now the truth loomed before her like an unclimbable mountain. Samuel Harris wasn't just the charming doctor in a white coat. He was a monument, a man perched atop the clouds, while she, Olivia Smith, was a mere speck of dust in the wind of everyday life. She struggled with rent, counting spare change in her wallet, scraping by with petty worries like a clumsy tightrope walker. They weren't in the same league, not even in the same world, barely even close. She told herself like a vow before a mirror. Accept it, Olivia, the sooner the better, so this heart stops chasing foolish dreams. But while she tried to build a wall between them, Samuel sensed her shift like a keen explorer spotting tracks in the desert. At first, he thought he was imagining it. Olivia started avoiding him, no longer showing up at the coffee shop, ignoring his texts, skipping follow-ups. But then it clicked. She was pulling away, and the thought of losing her before he could explore the spark igniting in his chest made him restless, like waves crashing against rocks. So, on a fateful evening, Samuel took action. Olivia had just finished her shift at the dusty old bookstore, where creaky shelves were her companions, her bag slung over her shoulder, her weary feet dragging along the cold sidewalk. Streetlights cast her shadow long and thin, a solitary figure amid the bustling crowd. And then there he was, Samuel Harris, leaning against a sleek black car like a panther on the prowl, arms crossed, his deep blue eyes locking onto her like a lighthouse seeking a lost ship. Olivia's heart leapt into her throat, as if trying to escape her chest. "Samuel," she blurted, her voice quivering like dry leaves in the wind, feeling like she'd just been hit with a shot of adrenaline. He stepped closer, his gaze unwavering, his voice calm but carrying an undercurrent she'd never heard before. "Are you avoiding me?" Olivia turned her face away, dodging his piercing stare like it was an arrow aimed at her heart. "No, I've just been busy," she mumbled, the clumsy lie tumbling out like shards of a fragile porcelain vase. Samuel sighed, closing the gap further until they were a breath apart. "Olivia," he said, his voice softer, gentle as a breeze through the trees, "don't lie to me anymore." She clenched her fists, nails digging into her palms as if to hold onto the scraps of her unraveling composure. "Why does it matter?" she burst out, her voice rising like a bird lost from its flock. "You're you, a millionaire, a famous doctor, and I'm me, just an ordinary girl. We come from different worlds, Samuel. I don't want people thinking I'm chasing you for your money." She swallowed hard, her throat dry as a desert at noon. Samuel stared at her for a long moment, his eyes deep as a lake reflecting a night sky. Then he laughed, not mocking, not cruel, but a disbelieving, warm chuckle like a fire warming a cold room. Olivia felt her cheeks blaze, tiny furnaces flaring to life. "Why are you laughing?" she asked, her voice trembling with confusion. Samuel shook his head. his expression softening like moonlight after a storm. "Because Olivia," he whispered, his tone low like a confession, "you're the first person in my life to run from me because of my money." Her lips parted, but words stuck in her throat like birds trapped in a cage. For the first time, she saw weariness in his eyes. Not the confidence of a doctor or the glamour of a millionaire, but the look of a simple man, yearning to be understood, to connect. And in that moment, the sturdy wall in her heart began to waver like a fortress before the wind. Olivia had tried her hardest to keep her distance from Samuel. She avoided the coffee shop like it was cursed, turned down his invitations, first politely like a lady of old, then firmly like a warrior guarding a stronghold. She ignored his texts, short messages checking on her health, each one a tiny dagger pricking her conscience, making her heart ache with guilt. But no matter how far she pushed him away, one truth she couldn't escape. Whenever his name lit up her phone, her fingers itched as if bewitched, longing to reply. Whenever she passed the clinic, her steps slowed as if someone held her back, her eyes sneaking glances through the glass despite her mind screaming, "Don't!" And every night when she closed her eyes she saw his face, his gentle smile like sunlight through leaves, his warm voice like a melody lulling her to sleep, his presence a flame warming her cold soul. Terrified her to her very core. Samuel Harris wasn't just someone she could love. He was someone who could make her lose herself, like a small boat swept into a vast ocean. And that was scarier than the thought of him leaving her. So Olivia did the only thing she knew. She ran like a fledgling bird afraid of the wide sky, like a lost traveler seeking home. But deep down she knew this flight couldn't last forever. Not when her heart still beat wildly for him. Not when his eyes still sought her among a sea of faces. But Samuel Harris wasn't one to give up easily. Never had been, not from the start. He gave Olivia space like a patient gardener waiting for a young bud to bloom, granting her time to process, to face the tidal wave of emotions swirling between them. Days stretched into weeks, then into a quiet string of silences, but Olivia kept the door to her heart firmly locked, refusing to let him in. Samuel understood, but he couldn't let it slip away like sand through his fingers. Instead of pursuing her with grand romantic gestures straight out of a novel, he chose to simply appear, gently, quietly, like moonlight filtering through the dark. He stopped by the bookstore where she worked, pretending to flip through dusty old volumes while deftly sparking small conversations, light as a breeze over a field. He lingered at the coffee shop at his usual corner table, a silent presence in her line of sight. Not pushing, not pressing, just there like a lighthouse awaiting a wayward ship's return. Gradually, something miraculous happened. Olivia stopped dodging him, no longer fumbling with awkward excuses like an actor forgetting their lines. One day, she unexpectedly laughed. A clear, genuine sound like bells ringing through a winter day. At an offhand remark he made about his habit of drinking coffee too bitter. Samuel stared at her, stunned, his heart fluttering like a bird beating its wings in his chest. For the first time in weeks, he saw a crack in the sturdy wall she'd built, like the first ray of sunlight piercing through thick clouds. But just as Olivia began to feel at ease, started to think that perhaps the gap between them wasn't an uncrossable chasm, fate dealt an unexpected card, appending everything like a chessboard flipped mid-game. That night, Olivia stayed late at the bookstore, her head throbbing like a hammer against old wood, her limbs heavy as if weighed down by lead. She'd felt off all day, her body drained like a rusty machine running out of oil, but she told herself it was just exhaustion from long, stressful days. "I'll rest at home and it'll be fine," she whispered to herself, a feeble comfort in front of the mirror. But as she stepped onto the sidewalk, the world tilted like a seasick boat, her vision blurring like a painting smeared with water, her knees buckling like dry twigs snapping in the wind. Then everything sank into darkness, deep and vast as the ocean swallowing the light. When Olivia awoke, she found herself somewhere warm and soft, as if cradled by clouds. Smooth sheets lay beneath her, and the steady beeping of machines hummed like the rhythm of life. She slowly opened her eyes, the gentle glow of a hospital room filtering in, and the first person she saw was him, Samuel Harris, sitting beside her bed, elbows propped on his knees, his face etched with worry like a stark painting in a storm. His dark hair was disheveled, as if he'd run his hands through it dozens of times in distress. When their eyes met, he let out a long breath, as if shedding a mountain from his chest. "Olivia," he whispered, his voice low and hoarse like a lullaby in the dark. "You scared the hell out of me." Her throat was parched, dry as a desert after a drought. "What happened?" she asked, her voice faint as falling leaves. Samuel leaned forward, his deep blue eyes shimmering with tension. "You collapsed on the street," he said, his voice trembling like a string pulled too tight. "A passerby called an ambulance. When I found out you were here," he swallowed hard, as if holding back a wave of emotion, "I came as fast as I could." Olivia blinked slowly, her mind spinning like a jammed wheel. He'd come for her, dropped everything, his work, the packed schedule of a millionaire doctor, just to sit here by her side. Suddenly, the wall she'd so carefully built, the reason she'd told herself to stay away, all dissolved like mist before the morning sun. The soft hospital light illuminated his face, highlighting sharp features now tinged with fatigue. Samuel sat there, hands clasped tightly as if in prayer, his usual confidence giving way to raw concern. "You had a high fever, dehydration, exhaustion," he continued, his voice low like a confession. "You've been pushing yourself too hard." Olivia swallowed, trying to sit up, but he was there in an instant, his hands on her shoulders, supporting her with a gentleness like cradling a fragile petal. For the first time she saw in his eyes not pity, not duty as a doctor, but something fierce and deep, like a fire smoldering in a cold night. Her chest tightened, a mix of ache and confusion. He shouldn't be here, shouldn't look at her like that, because if he did she might start believing this was real. She took a deep breath, trying to push him away as she always did with emotions that threatened her heart. "You shouldn't be here," she said, her voice small like a whisper through leaves. Samuel frowned, a flicker of surprise in his eyes. "What do you mean?" Olivia forced herself to look away, avoiding his gaze like a flame that frightened her. "You don't need to do this." She gestured weakly around the room, her voice trembling. "Taking care of me, sitting here all night, acting like I matter." Samuel's body stilled. Then his expression darkened, his voice low and sharp like a blade. "You think I'm here out of obligation?" She opened her mouth, but the words caught like birds trapped in a cage, because yes, that's exactly what she thought. She feared being a burden, feared being the girl he pitied. She forced out, "I don't need your charity." Samuel's eyes flashed, a spark of anger, frustration, and something deeper. "This isn't charity, Olivia," he said, his voice taut like a string about to snap. "This is me caring about you." She let out a short, dry laugh, brittle like crunching leaves. "Why?" His fingers curled, gripping the chair's edges. "What do you mean, why?" "Why me?" she whispered, her throat tightening as if choked. "You have everything, money, success, women who do anything to be with you. So why me?" His breath hitched, his deep blue eyes piercing her like they could see into her soul. Then he spoke, his voice low like a vow. "Because I like you, Olivia. I really like you." Olivia Smith's heart stopped, like a lost bird caught in a stormy sky, as Samuel's words hung between them, heavy as a stone dropping into a still lake, sending ripples she couldn't ignore. But before she could process it, before she dared let herself believe, that familiar fear surged up again, creeping like shadows through a cracked door. She shook her head, her slender fingers clutching the hospital blanket, crumpling it like her soul at that moment. "No," she said, her voice trembling like wine through dry branches. "That's ridiculous." Samuel's jaw tightened, his deep blue eyes sharp as a blade, but behind them flickered a brief glint of hurt. "Why not?" he asked, his voice low like waves crashing against rocks. Olivia swallowed, her chest constricting as if squeezed tight. "You have everything," she whispered, her voice quivering like leaves in a cold breeze. "And I have nothing. How can I believe you actually need me?" Silence descended, thick as a moonless night. Samuel's gaze didn't waver, but for the first time, Olivia saw a crack in those eyes, like crystal shattering under light, revealing a vulnerability she'd never suspected. He took a deep breath, his hands clenching into fists before slowly relaxing, as if releasing invisible burdens. For a long moment he said nothing, just looked at her, his deep blue eyes like a fathomless lake searching for something in her. A conflict, a hidden pain she'd never seen in this ever-confident man. Then he spoke, his voice steady but soft as a summer breeze. "You think I have everything? That my life is perfect? That I don't know what it's like to feel empty?" Olivia's throat tightened, as if her breath were being stolen. "Don't you?" she asked, her voice small like a whisper through leaves. Samuel let out a short breath, a bitter laugh escaping like smoke dissolving into cold air. He shook his head, his gaze distant as if peering into a buried past. "No, Olivia, it's not like that." She looked up at him, startled by the edge of hurt laced in his voice. To her, Samuel had always been an unshakable monument, brilliantly successful, wealthy as a king, confident as the sun that never sets. But now, for the first time, she saw a different man. A broken Samuel real with scars hidden beneath his perfect exterior. "I wasn't always like this," he continued, his hands rubbing together unconsciously, as if soothing old memories. "I didn't grow up in luxury. My parents worked themselves to the bone, but we always struggled. Every penny was sweat and tears." Olivia held her breath, listening as he spoke, not with his usual confidence but with a quiet honesty, like a stream slipping through rocks, making her heart ache with each word. "I got into med school on scholarships and part-time jobs, washing dishes, delivering packages, anything to scrape by. When I finally became a doctor, when the money started coming in, I thought I'd made it. I thought that was the finish line, that I'd done everything right." His voice dipped, like the sun fading on the horizon. "Then I met someone." Olivia's stomach twisted, as if someone had wrenched it tight. "She was beautiful, smart, everything I thought I wanted," he said, his jaw clenching as if holding back painful memories. "She said she loved me, and I believed her." Olivia felt her heart constrict. She knew where this story was headed, like an old book she'd read to the end but didn't want to believe. "What happened?" she whispered, her voice faint as falling leaves. Samuel sighed, deep as a gust sweeping through an empty field. "She didn't love me," he said, his voice soft but sharp like a knife slicing paper. "She loved my money." Olivia felt a pang in her chest, like an invisible arrow striking through. Samuel glanced at her, his expression guarded like an unfinished painting. "I found out she was seeing someone else behind my back," he went on, his tone even but laced with bitterness. "Every word she said, everything we had, was just an act, a perfect performance I was too foolish to see through." She drew a sharp breath, her mind reeling like a lost wheel. This wasn't the Samuel she'd imagined, not the confident doctor, not the flawless millionaire. This was a man betrayed, deeply wounded, carrying invisible scars no one saw, just like her, just like the night she told herself she wasn't enough. "I haven't really let anyone close since then," Samuel admitted, rubbing the back of his neck with a weary air, like a traveler lost in a desert. "I told myself I didn't need love, that it was easier to be alone." He looked up, his eyes burning into her like a fire smoldering in a cold night. "But then I met you." Olivia froze, her heart stopping, as if time itself had been suspended in that moment. Suddenly, everything else faded, the hospital with its steady beeps, the past full of hurt, the fears like haunting shadows, leaving only him and her, and a raw truth between them that couldn't be denied. She swallowed, trying to find her voice amid the storm of emotions. "Samuel!" He shook his head, cutting her off, stepping closer as if drawn by an invisible thread. Now he stood before her, so close she could feel his warmth, like sunlight filtering through leaves after rain. "I don't care what you have or don't have," he said, his voice rough, brimming with emotion like a river breaking its dam. "I don't care that you didn't come from wealth. I don't care that you think you're not enough." His fingers brushed hers, hesitant like a bird afraid to fly too far, giving her the chance to pull away. But she couldn't. "The only thing I care about," he whispered, his voice tender as a lullaby, "is you." Outside the window, the city lights twinkled against the night sky, like stars fallen to earth. The gentle hum of the night filled the silence between them, resonant as the earth's breath. Then Samuel lifted her chin, soft as if cradling a fragile flower, until their eyes met, deep blue against soft brown, like the sky meeting the ground. "I want you, Olivia," he murmured, his voice steady as a vow under moonlight. "Just you." Her breath caught, her heart racing like a wild horse breaking free. And for the first time she let herself believe, not with her mind, but with a heart cracked yet yearning to heal. That night, Olivia lay awake in her hospital bed, her eyes lost in the blank white ceiling, like gazing at a starless sky. Her heart was a tangled mess, like threads with no beginning or end. Samuel's words echoed in her mind, gentle yet resolute as a river flowing endlessly. I want you, Olivia. Just you. She'd spent so many years believing she wasn't enough, too ordinary, too small in a vast world. Love to her had always been a distant dream, like a star she could admire but never touch. But Samuel had chosen her, not for what she lacked, but for who she was, scars and fears and all. The question now wasn't whether he meant it, but whether she could step out of her own shadows, whether she could trust him and trust herself.